Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. The Marxist Theory of Art by A.V. Lunacharsky. Aesthetics and its forms. 2. If we turn our attention to the vast world of the non-aesthetic, we will see that it first of all breaks up into anti-aesthetic phenomena proper and relatively indifferent phenomena. We call anti-aesthetic phenomena those whose perception is accompanied by negative affect. The negative affect is accompanied by any staging of the vitality of overconsumption. One might think, therefore, that the vitality of overconsumption destroys the possibility of stating the anti-aestheticism of those or other phenomena. This is partly true. A cheerful person is inclined to find everything tolerable, but it is important to remember that it is not about the vitality for the whole organism, not even for its separate organs, but for the elements. No matter how much energy an organism accumulates in general, a flicker of bright light in front of the eyes, for example, cannot help but cause an overuse of visual energy. Hearing may be able to absorb a sea of sounds, but even a minor dissonance destroys some auditory elements, giving them a painful jolt. Anything that requires an excessive and unnecessary expenditure of energy that causes the organ to work improperly is anti-aesthetic. Formal ugliness would be anything that is directly opposite to formal beauty. Anything associated with suffering, sickness, and weakness, etc., is perceived as ugly in content. But here we encounter a new phenomenon. There's no doubt that man considers all manifestations of illness, stupidity, in a word, weak, reduced, degenerate life, to be ugly. The emergence of such an instinct is not only quite understandable, in view of the fact that the spectacle of suffering and weakness makes our soul sympathetically ill, but also expedient, since repulsiveness to everything degenerate preserves the power of the species, leads to interbreeding or alliance of the best representatives of the type. However, weak people, who thus become objects of contempt, must somehow live. Meanwhile, the ranks of those oppressed by fate are still replenished by those who are quite unjustly oppressed by society, the poor. Contempt for the sick, the miserable, cannot be a legitimate feeling in the poor person, who himself feels neglected and miserable. The sympathetic pain one feels makes the healthy and strong crinkle and say, "Away with this sick man," but it turns into sympathy in the conventional sense in a heart accustomed to suffering. Mutual compassion, mutual support, become necessities for the poor and unfortunate. A morality and religion of the destitute emerges, consisting invariably in the proclamation of suffering as redemption followed by bliss. Thus, the sight of the most terrible suffering is little by little associated with a vision of the pleasures of the kingdom of heaven, or, for the even more weary, the rest of nirvana. This outlook is inculcated in all democracy, since suffering is its lot, but the labor democracy of the new age is strengthened by the very process of labor. The simple life it leads, the struggle against privation, all this hardens body and soul, while the truly aristocratic family perish under the burden of idleness and excess. Democracy begins to realize its strength. It shakes off the dreams that unhappy people cast upon it, and creates its morals, its religion. Offensive, full of hope, proclaiming struggle and labor as the meaning of life, reorganizing society and solidarity as an ideal, because surely nothing fosters solidarity as much as a joint struggle against an incomparably stronger opponent. So there is no need to mix public democracy with the degenerate, the miserable, the ugly, and the weak. In accordance with the morals and religion of the weak, their aesthetics also develop. We shall return to this question. Here, it suffices to say that this aesthetic opens the door to the anti-aesthetic, relying on a sense of compassion, on a thirst for redemption, etc. The task of the art of the weak becomes to make suffering, dying, weakness beautiful. And to do justice to these people who have been wronged by life, they excel in this kind of art. But next to the anti-aesthetic, by virtue of weakness, there are other phenomena, namely fear-mongering, more powerful than man, than the perceiving subject. There is no doubt that fear is an extremely unpleasant affect. The frightened organism prepares to attack and flee, huddles, ruffles, screams, freezes, and follows the terrible object with goggled eyes. The heart convulses with blood, and when the fear has passed, there comes a complete relaxation. So exhausted are all the organs. But the terrible cannot inspire disgust. It is at the same time power, and should sympathetically infect the observer with a sense of power, if this mental movement is not paralyzed by the instinct of self-preservation. If we succeed in putting this instinct to sleep temporarily or weakening it, we have a right to expect a strong aesthetic emotion from the terrible. Indeed, we will be infected with a vitality far superior to our own. The facts show that our assumption is perfectly correct. Art, by depicting a roaring lion, all sorts of angry monsters, etc., undoubtedly lets us experience the terrible without threatening us. Lovers of strong feelings derive their aesthetic affect from restraining the manifestation of the instinct of self-preservation and enjoying the spectacle of power. Anger itself, not impotent anger, of course, is a pleasant emotion, a martial emotion. The warlike forefathers called war a military pastime, and it is not without reason that poets, when describing a hero who angrily crushes everything around him, compare him to God. Out of the tent, Peter comes out of the tent, his eyes shining, his countenance is terrible, his movements are swift, he is beautiful, he is all like God's thunderstorm. In the last line, we find a perfect explanation of the so-called dynamically majestic. A thunderstorm, with its gusts of storm, its roaring torrents, its cannonade of thunder and dazzling flashes of lightning, its crawling masses of clouds, still strikes the imagination now as it did in primeval times. Especially southern tropical thunderstorms inspire the idea of a tremendous power, angry and crushing. Since man is terrified, crammed into a corner and trembling there, he cannot, of course, appreciate the phenomenon from an aesthetic point of view. But who does not know what an exhilarating feeling of freshness and courage one gets when he fearlessly observes the raging elements? This is because the tremendous energy discharged by nature with such magnificence sympathetically infects us with a sense of power and scope. But the majestic manifests itself not only as enormous, overwhelming action, but also as statically majestic at rest. It is clear from the term itself that the aesthetic emotion here is a sense of grandeur. Why does one enjoy seeing the sea in front of one's eyes, the sky encompassing an unusually wide horizon? A theory has been advanced according to which man, feeling himself insignificant before the infinity, at the same time realizes with pleasure that all this immensity lies in his consciousness. But it is hardly possible, through self-observation, to find in the feeling of admiring the majestic on the one hand a sense of humiliation, and on the other, intellectual pride. First of all, if you manage to observe in yourself the rapturous feeling excited by the statically majestic, you will notice that it is a quiet and deep mood, bordering on self-forgetfulness. The object as if it occupies with itself the entire field of consciousness. This is why they say, to be forgotten in the rapture of contemplation, to sink entirely into contemplation, etc. Quiet awe is the feeling felt before the still majestic. If we analyze the concept of the majestic, we see that the majestic are those phenomena in which large masses, spaces, or forces are united by an extremely simple principle. The immense expanse of the sea is uniform in its uniform rhythm of waves. The sky is vast and simple, regardless of whether we observe it by day or night. Irregular outlines of clouds, irregular groups of stars, very little violate the overall unity of this colossal dome. Everything majestic is easy to perceive, for it is simple. If you pay attention to the details, or if the details come forward at all, the impression of majesty disappears. But, being easily perceived, the majestic with force excites the nervous system. It does not crush its functions, does not make it respond in 1,000 different ways, but shakes it with a powerful and monotonous rhythm, resulting in a sweet, semi-hypnotic state. You, half asleep, without moving a single member, admiring the barely rising azure smooth surface of the sea, the azure tint of the sky. Everything in front of you is smooth, wide. The eye describes large arcs, freely looking over the horizon. A small spot of sail sinks in the general impression of monotony. But this monotony does not cause boredom. The soul is excited. The proper, free work done by the nervous system, in general, is enormous. It can, in a sensitive person, bring tears of happiness to the eyes. The release of tears testifies to the increased flow of blood to the brain, to the energetic life of the brain. If the sea is suddenly covered with many colorful ships, if a race begins between them, if swimmers splash near the shore, if a large steamer begins to make couples and slowly turn in the harbor, if all this vivid picture, full of details, captures you, the impression of grandeur disappears. Your posture becomes alive, you will smile, worry, 1,000 feelings and thoughts will run in your brain. It will be funny, picturesque. You will feel that the intensity of feeling is incomparably lower than when you were alone with the sea, forgetting about yourself, becoming yourself like a corner of a deep, rhythmic, endless sea. But the work of the senses is richer, more diverse. The audience arrives. You hear multilingual chatter all around you, bursts of laughter. The harbor is hectic and bustling, as if in an incomprehensible human anthill. The sea is crowded with dozens, hundreds of ships. You get dizzy. Enough noise, colors, movement. The nerves are confused. They do not have time to follow everything. They get tired, and the intensity of feeling has finally fallen. At the maximum variety, you get so little of anything whole. The movements of the nerves are so crushed that you get bored of this motley. It quickly bores you, at the same time fatiguing. But make another assumption. Recently still calm sea suddenly turned black and covered with whitish crests of foam. Its noise, even as a sleeper's breathing, becomes insistent and menacing. Foamy waves run onto the shore and, crashing, hissing, rattling gravel, climbs farther and farther. The sky has long been covered with clouds. Everything is darkened, boiling over. The noise intensifies, the sea rises, resents, shrieks, rises to the shore. The sky seems to shake with terrible thunder, and lightning tongues fall in waves exploding to the sky in chaotic motion. Some incomprehensible battle is playing out before you. Several elements have collided in a monstrous struggle. Everything in your chest trembles, your heart beats, your muscles clench, your eyes shine. You greet the storm with new and new admiration at every thunderclap, and you feel the joy of struggle and strength growing in you, just as in these birds, which, with a sharp cry, cheerful and excited, are flying between heaven and earth. The enormity of the impulse and the struggle of forces rises in you, infecting you with its power, because you involuntarily perceive it as a struggle of living, resentful forces. Unity and diversity is almost a necessary principle of the aesthetic, because diversity means completeness and the dispersion of overcapacitated energy, and unity means the correctness of the work that facilitates perception. However, it is a mistake to think that this principle is the essence of aesthetics. In the majestic, unity prevails, sometimes to the exclusion of variety. In the pictorial, as we shall see, variety gets the upper hand over unity. What the beautiful loses in variety, it can gain in intensity, approaching the majestic. What it loses in unity can be replenished by piquancy, by refinement of juxtapositions and contrasts, approaching the pictorial. But more about this below. We have already talked about the fact that the terrible can be aesthetic. The dynamically majestic is always terrible in the sense that if it is turned against us, it would crush us. Only a certain objectivity allows us to evaluate phenomena aesthetically, whereas a subjective interest or personal attitude to the evaluated object arouses in us a mass of movements and feelings, which disturb and obscure the purity of our perception. This is especially true where evaluation depends on sympathetic associations. When we look at the strong and terrible, we can sympathetically feel an awareness of strength and courage, but we can instead pay attention mainly to the unpleasant consequences of our personal encounter with such an enemy. The beauty of the majestic and formidable is inaccessible to cowards. The majestic and formidable is evident not only in itself, but also in its results, in the obstacles it overcomes, in the destruction it produces. The terrible, the formidable, is that which is capable of destruction, of causing suffering. Man is surrounded on all sides by elemental enemies of this kind, but must oppose them with courage. The heroic struggle is a tragic spectacle, because here we are present at the clash of forces that are not only angry, victorious, destructive, they are suppressed. They fall, they suffer. When we see tragic events in life, we sympathetically feel both the feelings of struggle and the suffering of defeat. We see horror and suffering, we are horrified and afflicted. Again, horror and suffering are negative affects, but strong ones. Their negativity lies in the tremendous expenditure of energy for self-protection, in the convulsive movements that fear of pain and pain itself cause in us. It is worth suppressing these movements, depriving the emotions of fear and suffering of their external expression, and their proportion will change. The amount of convulsive and wrong work will decrease, and if that which causes horror and suffering is able to cause right work, that is, to infect us with feelings of activity, courage, fighting cheer, or generally, if it is great, that is, causes in us intense and uncomplicated excitement, then we will enjoy the tragic. The more accessible the tragic beautiful is, the larger the observer's soul, the less amenable it is to fear with all its consequences, the more accustomed it is to experiencing in general those mental movements that constitute the essence of the tragic. It is particularly easy for art to achieve aesthetic results by depicting the tragic, as we have already mentioned when speaking of the terrible in general. All of the content of the tragic is reproduced by art, but because we do not forget that we are dealing with an image, we can remain calm. That is, we cannot respond to an impression with outward movements in self-defense or assistance. To teach one to be at peace with the tragic, to experience the beauty of horror, of struggle, to be able to appreciate in the suffering of heroes their heroism, is a great task. The terrible, as well as suffering, is portrayed by truly tragic art as something beautiful, worthy of amazement. It teaches us in life to be able to keep our composure before the terrible, not to shed tears of weakness, not to whimper over the anguish of our brothers who are falling beside us. Freedom from petty fear, from cowardice, is obtained only at the cost of the habit of the terrible. Freedom from tearful compassion, which binds us hand and foot in a hard struggle, only comes at the price of getting used to the spectacle of suffering. This is the purification that gives the tragic beautiful its deepest meaning. It is not indifference that it fosters in us, but the ability to appreciate the struggle for its strength, for the intensity of life in it, the ability to pay attention to courage, agility, resourcefulness, and not to wounds and groans. To cultivate courage and humanity is a great undertaking, which true tragic art serves. But tragedy is getting shallower. Now we hear at every turn the demand to depict the tragic of ordinary life. Unfortunately, we do not see the tragic in ordinary life. Pettiness, prejudice, greed, petty self-love, Philistine moping and laziness. Are these elements of the tragic? In order that death, illness, insurmountable fate, all the terrible things that crush everyone equally be perceived as tragic, they need to be confronted by something solid, large, courageous. The chained Prometheus is a tragedy, but the father of a family convicted of embezzlement is not, even if the suffering of him, his wife, his children was very strong. What can these sufferings give us? How and in what way do they elevate us? Do they infect us with elevated life? Where there is no heightened life, where there is no heroic, there is no tragedy. Dr. Stockman is a tragedy, though there is no special suffering, and Maeterlinck's decadent dramas, despite their sea of suffering, are dull nightmares. The desire of modern art to depict a weakened life, not by ridiculing it, but by sympathizing with it, is true decadence. How can I experience pleasure while being infected by the fear of death? Yet, obviously, enjoyment is experienced. How gray, flabby, motionless life must be for a man to enjoy shedding tears at the sight of the grief of everyday people, for him to be interested even in the peripecias of the life of Chekhov's three sisters and their like. When the housewives gather for a cup of tea, they talk among themselves about all sorts of nonsense concerning their neighbors, which seems more boring because everything is the same, and yet they groan and lean on each other and whisper and gloat. Pathetic events proliferate into something significant in their impenetrably countless daily lives. Only the general decline of life can explain why, next to the beautiful, the majestic, and the tragic, an aesthetic of the pathetic, the decrepit, the aching, the useless has emerged. At the worst stages of human life, his aesthetic sense still compelled him to look for something bright, strong, exceptional, if not beautiful, and to ridicule the banal. Before the fact of the serious and aesthetic attitude toward vulgarity, one stops almost in horror. Obviously, the ability to live an elevated life is gradually lost and boiled over in the hustle and bustle of the commonplace, and the depiction of vulgarity seems to be highly interesting if the artist has succeeded in evoking many associations of all kinds, by which the common person is used to living, has recalled many vulgar images which have lost their banality in the eyes of the commoner and have become dear to him, has stirred up many little feelings to which the common person is accustomed and by which his soul lives. In speaking of the tragic beautiful, we must willy-nilly ascertain the grinding of the sense of tragic beauty. The vulgar, the pathetic, the weak can also serve as a source of aesthetic emotion, namely by arousing laughter, that is, as a comic. Strictly speaking, the comic is not the beautiful. Works of art that pursue the goal of depicting the comic can be beautiful because they artistically process the subject. That is, they make it easier for us to perceive a mass of diverse and vivid phenomena. The comic is not beautiful in itself, but it nevertheless evokes an aesthetic emotion, merriment. Cheerfulness is a pleasant state of organism, at which all its organs are in free excitement. As merriment is often contrasted with boredom, it is clear that the excitement of the nervous system, increased metabolism, a necessary feature of merriment, but of course, this excitement must not go either to the absolute boundary, determined by the total energy reserve of the body, nor the private boundary of energy reserve of each individual element of it. If we bring the organism into excitement and leave it in a complete freedom of action, this would be tantamount to bringing it into a cheerful mood. Free excitement and merriment are one and the same. What are the properties of the comic that make it possible for it to excite us and leave us free to play with the forces whose action it has awakened? Excitement is possible in only one form, namely, as the resolution of vitality. You see something unfamiliar, mysterious, in the brain that is excited by vitality, a disturbance of the usual course of work, a difficulty. The brain seeks some solution, i.e., seeks to know the unfamiliar, to reduce it to something known, to know how to relate to it. Associations arise one after another. Energy dissipates in considerable quantity. The blood flow increases accordingly. Work may be experienced as something pleasurable if the expenditure of energy in general does not exceed the influx, which would cause fatigue, and if the work of the brain is not complicated by negative coaffectional elements, such as fear of the unknown, anxiety, annoyance, etc. But here the task is resolved. Everything goes into its rut. The work is over, and if you are not fatigued, you feel pleasantly excited and energized, as after a non-tiring gymnastics session. It goes without saying that the greater the initial vitality, the more the phenomenon deviates from the commonplace pattern, the greater will be the supply of the brain. On the other hand, the sooner and more unexpectedly the elimination of vitality follows, the higher will be the feeling of pleasant relief and excess of energy. The essence of the comic is that it induces imaginary vitality in the psyche. You put on a mask and scare the child. He was afraid of looking at you. He seizes the anxiety and horror. He is ready to cry. But you just took off the mask. He recognized you. He sees that nothing is wrong and laughs and rejoices and says, "More!" All comic acts on this type. It is original, it is different from the ordinary, but this difference turns out to be in the next moment imaginary or unimportant. All small deviations from the usual type of human appearance are funny, but if they cross a certain boundary, they become repulsive, ugly. Small breaches of decency are ridiculous. Larger ones cause indignation. Small misfortunes are ludicrous, but larger misfortunes arouse compassion. In all these cases, we have discussed indignation and compassion in an underdeveloped form, suppressed by a consideration of their insignificance and resolved with unexpected ease. When we observe a known phenomenon, we expect its known natural consequences. If they are not there, and events take an unexpected turn, we feel a jolt and either think seriously, or, having felt the insignificance and only imaginary significance of the deviation, we laugh. Your friend, whose views are well known to you, suddenly expresses in the company of strangers opinions completely opposite to his usual views. This outrages and amazes you. As you return home with him, you seriously remark to him that you don't understand his behavior. Yes, I have by no means changed my views. I wanted to pardon this public. Then you laugh, for the supposed embarrassment is gone. But now you have the thought, but it is wrong to mislead our neighbors. Again, you make this remark to him in a serious tone. But they are pompous fools and pedants, he tells you, and proves it with facts. You laugh again at the fact that your difficulty was false, and still more at the thought of how these pedants are now seriously discussing the imaginary ideas of your friend, because every mistake is ridiculous, because it consists in acting unrelated to the circumstances, in failing to compare them, and more ridiculous the more self-confident the mistake maker is. However, if an error can have serious consequences, it becomes unfortunate, even terrible. A witticism is nothing more than a violation of the normal course of conversation and reasoning. If it is a witty thought of serious importance, it, throwing an unexpected light on this or that problem, facilitating your mental work, is simply pleasant, but does not cause laughter, the actual witticism. The actual witticism, witz, always consisting in an unexpected comparison, which for a moment causes surprise, then you claim, "Ah, yes," and laugh. Stupidity is also the violation of a logically correct train of thought. If someone says a stupid thing, you laugh, as you would a witticism, but if that stupidity or the unreasonableness of that person expressed in it can have unpleasant consequences, you are annoyed. In short, everywhere the emotion of mirth is where any strong and, generally speaking, negative emotion, bewilderment, fear, annoyance, disgust, indignation, etc., turns out to be delayed and is unexpectedly resolved. The best proof of the correctness of our conception of the comic can be found in an analysis of the very physiological phenomenon of laughter that accompanies the perception of the comic. We have considerable vitality, that is, as it were, a flow of energy out of us, restored by an intensified inflow of it in the form of a rush of blood to a given organ. Suddenly, the gap, so to speak, closes. It is necessary to stop the functioning organ, to which all the power flows. For this purpose, other organs are instinctively set in motion, which causes balancing of the distribution of nutrition. The energy of the working organ, so to speak, irradiates and excites adjacent organs. In the case under consideration, the brain centers excite the motor centers in a certain sequence, and the quantity of caused movements is determined by the previous excitation of the cortical centers. First, the facial muscles move, which we call a smile. Then the whole body is gradually set in motion. We laugh, we giggle, clap hands, stop. Laughter, that is, the concussion of the thoracic abdominal barrier and the convulsive expulsion of air from the lungs, according to Herb Spencer, has the significance that, by reducing the amount of oxygen in the body, it weakens the oxidation of the blood, and hence the force of its action, and thus protects the brain from excessive work, which has become, let us add, superfluous. We cannot enter into a detailed consideration of the whole field of the comic and the manifold forms of laughter. We will say only that the ability to look at many things with good-natured condescension, to notice various peculiarities and incongruities, but not to give them serious significance, constitutes the essence of humor. If we look down on the facts and treat them with contempt, then, as with good-natured forgiveness, many things will cause us to laugh, though not without a touch of indignation. This is the essence of satire. Laughter prevails in light satire, indignation prevails in bitter, scathing satire. It is curious to note, for example, such facts as the expression of an irritated opponent in an argument. Your opinion is ridiculous. The person is not laughing at all, but boiling, and he wants to say that, in fact, this opinion should not be taken seriously, and to stop the vitriol he has set by laughing. No one has yet done a complete analysis of laughter, while the different kinds of laughter offer an in-depth look at the human soul in general. This, of course, requires special and considerable work. If the comic does not belong proper to the realm of the beautiful, although it evokes an undoubted aesthetic emotion, the same must be said of the typical. The field of aesthetics is not only limited to the beautiful, but includes, in its narrowest understanding, the typical and the comic. If we consider both in the chapter of the genre of the beautiful, it is because, far from being beautiful in nature, the comic and the typical are powerful elements of the beautiful in art. Not everything that is typical in nature is beautiful, but certainly everything in art, for to the usual elements in the perception of works of art, one must also think of the artist's ability, of his organizing power. Chichikov is not beautiful, we do not admire him, but, despising him, we, firstly enjoy his typicality, and secondly, admire the genius of Gogol. The poem Dead Souls is terrible in its inner meaning, but it is beautiful because it associatively evokes the idea of the power of human genius. If we were to meet all the types of Gogol's immortal poem in life, we would by no means feel the uplifting emotion of beauty. But if we were observers, we would still rejoice in them, as a naturalist rejoices in a curious specimen. Everything typical evokes a positive appreciation, independent of an appreciation in terms of beauty and sublimity. What is beautiful? That which is aesthetic in all its elements, which consists of aesthetic lines, colors, sounds, evokes associations of delight, etc. What is majestic? That which communicates to our nervous system a harmonic rhythm, which infects us with heightened life. What is aesthetic? Anything that gives us an unusually large mass of perceptions per unit of energy expended. So, if we have before us a phenomenon which, though ugly and insignificant, nevertheless evokes in us a mass of perceptions, or enables us to embrace a great number of other phenomena, we will evaluate it positively. This is a case of the typical. Typical is instructive. It makes it possible in one image to embrace much. We see that the ugly and insignificant can be aesthetic, but for this it is necessary to ignore, to a certain extent, the ugliness and squalor of the examined object, to perceive it not too vividly and concretely, more by mind than by feeling. But this is nothing other than a scientific cognitive attitude. Indeed, in the typical, we have the transition from aesthetics to science, from the criterion of beauty to the criterion of truth, which serves as proof of their kinship and at the same time vividly characterizes their difference. Typicality can only be enjoyed by the intellectual man. He, like Leonardo da Vinci, will enjoy sketching a typical murderer, while the emotional man will turn away from this half-man, half-horned man with horror and disgust. Originality is a necessary condition of the comic, but not everything original evokes laughter. Any deviation from the ordinary, of course, attracts attention and increases the mental work done by the body. This increase will be all the more pleasant, the more aesthetic the features of the original are in general. Laughter comes only when a relatively large mental strain is resolved with unexpected ease. In general, any phenomenon that increases attention is characterized as original or interesting. Other things being equal, the original subject is aesthetically higher than the commonplace subject for any psyche possessing at least some reserve of energy, which is almost the general rule for man. With a considerable excess of energy, When the vitality of overstocking already manifests itself as a feeling of boredom, the thirst for the discharge of energy makes originality something desirable, almost to a greater extent than beauty. On the other hand, a person with a conservative brain, where the influx barely covers the necessary expenditure, feels annoyance at the sight of anything original. Herbert Spencer expresses extreme annoyance at the fact that nowadays they like to print the titles of books asymmetrically, generally violating the usual, rational appearance of the subject. In his opinion, this is a sign of the coming barbarism. Indeed, the new books are not at all prettier than the old ones, but they are original. The desire to enhance aesthetic dignity not through beauty, but through originality, characterizes the degree of satiety and boredom in society. The original begins to be appreciated usually in the mature period of civilization. Order, harmony, conditions of beauty, turn out to be something habitual, and the search for the source of aesthetic emotions begins in disorder. We will dwell on this phenomenon when considering the evolution of art. Of course, not all disorder is pleasing, even to the jaded man. He seeks pictorial disorder. The word pictorial already shows that this disorder, even if of natural origins, must have in it something artificial, intentional, as if invented by a painter. Indeed, in pictorial disorder lies an elusive order, a decorating spirit. A good and very simple example is the so-called golden ratio. Simple proportions, that is, the values relating to each other as whole numbers, are perceived in general more easily than irregular relations. This is explained, of course, by the fact that such proportions can be examined by the eye with a series of identical movements, that is, through a known rhythm of movements. But next to the aesthetic value of symmetrical divisions into two halves, into quarters, or into the middle and two wings, that is, into 3 and to 5 parts, the division of a line in the middle, an extreme ratio, is suddenly put forward. That is, so that the large section relates to the whole line as the smaller to the larger, 1 is to A as A is to B. Zeising saw something mystical in the fact that man himself, in the proportions of his body and in his books, boxes, doors, windows, etc., strives for a similar proportion. The commonality of this aspiration became rather shaky after a careful study by the great psychophysicist T. Fechner, but still a certain love for this kind of division is observed. It seems to be explained by the fact that the golden ratio is something between symmetry and completely one-sided asymmetry. In the first case, the smaller segment becomes equal to the larger, and in the second, it is equal to 0. It is this kind of subtle law that determines the pictoriality of disorder. Meanwhile, the ability to find a source of aesthetic pleasure in disorderly objects, the ability to grasp a fine regularity where there is no clear law, greatly extends the field of the aesthetic. Compare the symmetrical statues of the archaic period of Greek sculpture with the freedom of the classical period, or the free compositions of paintings by Renaissance masters with the frozen medieval symmetry of triptychs. It goes without saying, however, that formal pictoriality alone is not enough to make a strong impression. The growth of sensitivity to the picturesque was accompanied by an increasing appreciation of nature, whose diversity is rarely covered by a clearly expressed unity, the unity of light, the unity of character. That is what is inherent in most landscapes, so the word picturesque is most often applied to pictures of nature. But a picturesque landscape, in which individual, varied parts are freely scattered in an elusive aesthetic disorder, even if it is beautiful in its colors and lines, cannot give a sense of the truly beautiful. Only when it is majestic does it need no associative elements. It is we ourselves who invest nature with inexhaustible beauty, responding to its beauties and spiritualizing its features. We put into beauty the mood it evokes in us by association. Wild cliffs, steep paths, the surf of waves, strange lighting, suggest the idea of proud solitude, demonic forces, or brave outcasts of society who could choose such a place. The snowy plain, the foggy mountain, the vague, pale distance evoke the idea of endless, joyless road, vague, gray thoughts on the heart, no hope ahead. The more impressionable the psyche is, The sooner it is seized by one or another feeling at the sight of the ever-changing face of nature, the more hastily it translates its incomprehensible signs into human language. Landscapes, which evoke in us little-used images and feelings, we call fantastic. We generally call fantastic everything whose originality exceeds the limit of what is possible in reality, but which does not cause any serious zhizhnost, precisely because of its unreality. Everything in nature, which stimulates our fantasy, that causes free play in our brain, is pleasant and aesthetic. If our imagination works, in this case, due to nice tender features of a phenomenon, which aroused in its soft, happy tones, such a phenomenon we call poetic. The picturesque, the fantastic, the poetic, all these terms point to elements introduced by human creativity. The picturesque, in connection with the fantastic and poetic, can be attributed to the sphere of the beautiful with more right than the comic and the typical. But the aesthetic development of people, which leads to an increasing ability to find charm in phenomena, sometimes takes on a sickly character, thanks to which, in the search for the original, exquisitely picturesque, it turns into a love for the pretentious and overly refined. For a healthy person, the charm of some shouting, extravagant phenomenon, which arouses the delight of sworn aesthetes, is sometimes completely incomprehensible, while, for these aesthetes, the beautiful, the majestic, has already become vulgar, tiresome. The most annoying thing about these phenomena is that the direct aesthetic feeling is mingled with foolish boasting of the originality of taste, etc. One may say that a person is the more aesthetically developed, the more phenomena are able to give him aesthetic pleasure. If we remember how many ways are open to a person who is able to understand not only the beautiful and majestic, but also the tragic, the comic, the original, the picturesque, the typical, then we can easily imagine a personality which is able to take an interesting look at any object and show its aesthetic value to others. These are the true aesthetes. People who boast of refinement of tastes are not at all pioneers in the progressive course of mankind, but some strange terrestrial flower. A true aesthete can understand even their beauties, but he will retain in himself the gift of seeing beauty in what all mankind enjoys, what even a savage or a child can enjoy. The ability to enjoy aesthetically almost any object is reduced biologically to the subtlety of brain structure or to the great richness of the most varied associations. Like a magnificent instrument, the true aesthetician gives birth to sonorous harmony in his soul at every blow from the outside. Of course, in this way, it is easy to reach the sentimental feeling of perfection which does not have any possibility to distinguish between beauty and ugliness, but man avoids it owing to the sharp division of separate estimations. I can admire a typical villain because of his typicality, and at the same time realize the ugliness of his spirit and body. All different criteria of the same aesthetic live separately in the mind of a mature appreciator. He does not mix originality with beauty, beauty with magnificence, humor with typicality, etc. He is able, having examined the phenomenon from the most favorable point of view, having enjoyed it, to examine it critically, vigilantly tracing in it all the shortcomings. The ability to distinguish strictly between points of view is an important aesthetic ability. Biologically, it boils down to the fact that we perceive an object in such a way as to make only one organ work at full speed, reducing the activity of the others. To feel oysters with the palate and not with the eyes, to observe a peacock with the eyes and not listen to its cry, etc., to allow only one favorable row of associations to develop, muting the others. To relate to an object aesthetically means to perceive it with those organs, or with elements of the brain in which it can excite the most expedient work. That is, so that the evaluation in terms of beauty, the immediate affect, will be as high as possible. But as soon as we want to evaluate a known object, not in relation to us personally, but in relation to the higher good, that is, to the perfection of the species, we change the point of view. We emphasize among the associations those which make it possible to comprehend the phenomenon in question and its results, to comprehend its influence on the development of humanity. Finally, to consider a phenomenon from the point of view of truth is to perceive it as fully as possible, ignoring at the same time the totally affective coloring of sensations. operating only with pure sensations and such notions and conceptions which have nothing affective at their base, that is, no subjective judgments, but only objective sensations and perceptions. The human will, like a resonator, intensifies some associations over others, thus determining their further course. The higher centers of consciousness connect now with one organ, then with another. This ability to throw light on one group of phenomena of our consciousness or objects, leaving aside in the shadow the others, is justly considered an important adjustment. It has, as we see, great importance both in aesthetics in the broadest sense, that is, in the science of evaluation in general, and in aesthetics in the narrow sense, that is, in the science of direct evaluation. If we take a closer look at this process, we will see that its biological value consists just in the following: to evaluate correctly the phenomena, to be able to distinguish the harmful from the pleasant, the useful from the repulsive, to be able to use the harmful in one relationship to benefit in another, in a word, to have a different attitude towards the object, because, indeed, every object has an inexhaustible quantity of different relations to the person, depending on the circumstances. To know an object in all its direct and indirect relations to the human body is to know it perfectly. Such cognition must be both scientific and aesthetic, and practical in the broadest sense of the word. Such cognition itself makes the human soul rich, and, in addition, makes a man master of things, opens before him the way to happiness, enables him to derive this happiness from everything around him. The ideal of cognition, happiness, or beauty, which is the same thing, since happiness is the feeling of beauty of our own being and world, and good merge and intertwine in one aspiration of life for growth, for harmonious and luxurious development. Every step towards increasing strength helps harmonize the inner and outer world. Harmony itself increases strength again, and, like this infinitely, or more correctly speaking, as long as progress doesn't stop, this process will continue.